I had been thinking about it for many years and had already tried twice, failing to realize the following project. Now I will try again. I was thinking of a brief history of Italian astrology in the 20th century. Many years ago, I asked a student of mine from Milan to go and interview Rosita Cardano and to write with her precisely a brief history of Italian astrology in that century. Unfortunately, my student postponed several times, and in the meantime our beloved colleague left us forever. The second time I tried with Federico Capone, who, in hindsight, was the most suitable person for this purpose. He was already very ill, and despite this, we made an agreement that included a long trip of a colleague to Turin for this purpose. The meeting was scheduled for September, but during the August that preceded it, Federico Capone also left us with an immense void in the feelings and in the history he did not write. Two cavities that will never be filled again. This time I will try because I think this task falls to me. There are other colleagues, both male and female, with more seniority than me in the astrological field and in Italy, but not with such an intense experience and with a number of contacts equal to mine. Many have isolated themselves a bit during their entire life as scholars. Others have not had good relationships with some sectors of the art of Urania in Italy. From the first year that I began to deal with astrology, it was 1970, and I studied the subject for 12 hours a day, I made contact with practically all the big names of the time, but also with many anonymous colleagues who have remained so. Therefore, my short story will be from 1970 to today, and will be structured as through a path made of frames, images, personal accord, perhaps not organically structured and scientifically assembled, but from which it will be possible, I hope, to draw a lot of information on that historical period in relation to astrology with a series of unpublished news and transferred to me mostly orally, which would be lost forever if I did not put them on paper. I'll give you an example. How many of you know that Lucia Alberti, at the beginning of her studies in astrology, took lessons from Francesco Waldner? I will tell you this and many other things through the memory of my personal meetings with many colleagues, but also through a very large correspondence accumulated over 44 years. Next year, in fact, 45 years, will be, for me, a mini astrological jubilee. I'm writing in 2014, with extraordinary people, including Henri J. Gouchon, Michel and François Gauquelin, Angelo Brunini, and many others among the great contemporaries. Having been among the founders of SIDA and the founding editor of Ricerca 90, as well as among the very first collaborators of Gli Arcani Astra and Ciro and many other editorial initiatives, having published among the first Italian astrological books with a large specialized publisher, Armenia, and having had direct or epistolary relationships with hundreds of colleagues, I think I can offer this valuable contribution through a series of articles starting from January 2005, with the formula of the story novel and trying, obviously, to be as objective as possible in this journey that I hope you will take with me on the pages of Ricerca 90. Note, in fact, the articles published in Ricerca 90 starting from 2005 were 9, and today I propose them again collected in a small book in which I have left their content substantially intact. Massa Lubrense, August 2014. Of course, this is a brief history of recent Italian astrology as seen by me, and which stands out from other much more important ones, published by different authors. Note one above all, because this one perhaps was experienced more directly in first person, having had, the writer, the privilege of always maintaining very close and intense relationships with all or almost all the protagonists you will read about in the episodes that follow. I don't remember the exact day, even if all the other details are very clear to me, as if the scene I'm about to tell you about had taken place only half an hour ago. It was, however, the beginning of the winter of 1970, and I was at the military airport of Latina, where I was fulfilling my military service obligations. It was certainly early afternoon, and I, like my other comrades, was loitering along the pretty avenues of what, at least at that time, was an old airport mainly used for training pilots. On the obsolete twin-engine Piaggios, the ones with the two rear tails joined together, the avenues and the entire aeronautical center annexed to the airport were very well kept, and I really liked them on an aesthetic level. The order that I find in the barracks, in the hospitals, in the convents, always has the effect of a pleasant, positive suggestion in me. I was not, however, at all happy to find myself there, for what I considered at the time just a big waste of time. As a pure-blooded Aries, as I consider myself, having the sun about 3 degrees below the ascendant, and therefore also dominant, even if with a Cancer base, I have always conceived my days as volcanic. Working 3 times more than the average of my peers has never been a strategic project, but a necessity to live with great intensity, the carpe diem of the ancient Romans, a day of having fun or playing or killing time. For me was and is a day to be erased. The only exception was the time I spent with my ex-girlfriend wife, and with the current one who gave me the best years of my life. But there, at the Latina airport, I felt like I was throwing away a significant portion of my existence. I could have worn the clothes of an aeronautical officer having the requirements, but the character notes transmitted by the National Research Council, where I worked at the time, were terrible, subversive, and dangerous element. They were not wrong, since I myself define myself as a Bordagist communist, to the left of Trotsky. Churchill had said, more or less, you can't not be a communist at 20, and you can't still be one at 40. The same was true for me. Today I consider myself a moderate liberal and non-partisan. At 19 I was managing the electronic instrumentation laboratory of the Istituto Motori di Napoli of the CNR. I was also enrolled in physics, but my interests almost immediately turned to analytical psychology, yoga, macrobiotics, homeopathic medicine, etc. Uranus was transiting my radix Neptune near the bottom of the sky. My culture was decidedly good. I had devoured hundreds and hundreds of novels, but not in an omnivorous way, rather selecting above all the best of French and Russian literature of the 19th century, without neglecting Hemingway, Tomasi di Lampedusa, Siastia, and many others. Literature and cinema were 2 of my great passions. I loved photography and even won a national award. I developed my own films and worked in the darkroom. I wrote so well that a very good literature teacher one day refused to accept an essay as mine, because she said she can't have written it, considering it a masterpiece. Even at school, I never mistook a high accent for a low one, and I am still of the opinion that the first test to evaluate a person's culture is to have them write a text by hand under dictation. I also had 1,000 other interests. I was able to build a radio or a television, or repair a very expensive oscilloscope. I also frequented Giambattista Caligari and his magic switchboard, the center of radio amateurs and professional chess players, and I don't remember how many other things. Don't worry, I'm not writing this to force myself to appear to you like Benito Mussolini when he had his portrait taken bare-chested while he was mowing the wheat. I'm not trying to sew the best possible hagiographies onto myself. No, I'm telling you this because it is essential to understand the scene that follows, placing it in the context of those years and relating it precisely, not to an uncultured and incurious boy, but to a young man whose brain didn't rest for a single moment of the day. So I was walking along those wide and silent avenues, with large weeping willows on the sides of the road that amplified the charm of the place, and I stopped under the 3-story building where the airmen like me were living, a fellow soldier whose physiognomy I remember well, dark in color and with glasses with large black frames, who I later learned was a Scorpio and whose name I have forgotten since I have not seen or heard from him since the end of his military service, approached me and began to talk to me about astrology. He asked me what sign I belonged to. I did not know. This is an important point if we want to understand what astrology was in Italy in 1970. A young man with 1,000 cultural interests, applauded several times in film clubs, and who was able to write his school essays neatly and then do a second one for a friend in need, did not know, at 22, his own zodiac sign. If you can distance yourself from the daily dose of horoscopes that they make you sniff every day through the media, in every source and in every form, such a fact will seem unlikely to you. And instead, this tells you that in 1970, the diffusion of astrology in Italy was very low, almost non-existent, even in the form of horoscopes. I believe that this element is worthy of being considered with the utmost attention in the general context of the story that will follow in several installments and will be published exclusively on these pages. After my interlocutor had said only a few words, I remember that I threw myself at the unfortunate man, in a metaphorical sense, of course, with all the force of impact that I was and am capable of. How can you, in the 20th century, still believe this nonsense? A rather lively discussion ensued, even too much. Let's not forget that the other was a Scorpio of the classic type. Immediately a group of comrades formed around us who followed the very lively discussion for hours and hours. Of course, we got nowhere, but that night I didn't close my eyes for even a single minute. My friend's words echoed in my mind. How can you be so presumptuous as to think that the moon is capable of lifting billions of cubic meters of water, the tides, and then cannot act on us who are made for over 65% of the same element? This question echoed in my head 100, 1,000 times all night. I was prejudiced, as demonstrated by the verbal attack with which I reacted to the observations of my comrade in arms, but I had also been in depth analysis for 2 years, and was beginning to recognize the phenomenon of projection, and also what is meant by the expression, when you touch a nerve. I acknowledged with myself during one of the most important sleepless nights of my life that that boy had said sensible things along with other pure idiocies. The voracity with which this new curiosity began to devour me pushed me to study a strategy. As my comrade had advised me, the only way to decide with your own head whether it was valid knowledge or not was to study the subject and try to touch with your own hands its falsity or truth. So I did. Every weekend I went home on leave to Naples, and that Saturday I went to my late friend Luciano Guida, of the glorious bookstore of the same name in Piazza dei Martiri and asked him what I could read about astrology. I noticed a certain astonishment in his eyes, but the choice was nevertheless very limited. He had only 2 texts to offer me, the mammoth Sementovsky Kurylo, which seemed absolutely unsuitable to me because it was a treatise for already convinced readers, and a lighter and more journalistic Sotto il segno degli astri by Jacqueline Aimé and Joël de Gravelaine, Della Valle Editore. I chose the latter and devoured it in a few hours. I was more disturbed and confused than before. I said to myself, if even 30% of what is written in this text is true, then we are crazy not to use such a treasure trove of information. If, on the other hand, it is all bullshit, then I have only wasted time and a little money. But even in this book, strange coincidence, the reader was invited to study the material a little on his own, in order to develop a more in-depth opinion on it. From here to Sementovsky, the step was automatic. Thus began a phase that lasted many months, in which I had all the time I needed to study and try to understand. I studied from the very beginning, even 12 hours a day, and never less than 6 or 7. As in all things, I threw myself into it headlong. I started with mathematical calculations and had to understand many things on my own, without anyone's help. In those days it wasn't possible to call, say, Ciro Discepolo on the phone and ask him why that mathematical step or that formula, and the internet didn't even exist. The more I broke my bones on a difficult point, the more it became engraved forever in my memory. I immediately understood, at least this is my opinion, that to really assimilate the subject I had to follow a very simple practical method. Draw up the horoscope of a person I didn't know, study it for many hours, taking notes and asking myself what physical appearance this person had, what character he showed, what job he did, what hobbies he followed, etc. Subsequently, I spoke for several hours with the interested party. There at the airport we were all men, but the exercise continued after the military service also with women, and only after the consultant had moved away from me did the real study begin. Why was I completely wrong on that point? How could I not understand this? Where does it come from that he suffers from heart problems? And so on. By now I was becoming more and more convinced that I was probably dealing with raw material, still to be worked on for a long time, which nevertheless contained a great truth. There was no lack of human material, and the requests increased out of all proportion. The first horoscope for which I wrote a report was that of my niece Barbara, causing no small amount of displeasure to my poor sister Leah, who I would lose prematurely, especially when I told them big things, really big things. The person in front of me couldn't help but draw all the indignation for my incompetence on their faces. Then I memorized the mistake, and then, in the hours that followed, I did an analysis under the microscope, treasured every mistake to try not to make any more mistakes. My passion for these studies increased, so much so that I completely abandoned photography, which I loved so much. It didn't take me long to exhaust the very limited bibliography available in Italy that year, and I was forced to immediately switch to foreign texts, which in the early days were exclusively French and English. I didn't know French at all, and I was a bit of a guesser. I got by better with English, but I always had a dictionary in my hand. After this full immersion, almost in apnea, lasting many months to learn the basic technique of the subject by myself, I immediately felt the need to use more sophisticated tools, such as professional ephemerides and the tables of houses in order to implement on the HP 67, a small jewel of Hewlett-Packard precursor of the personal computer, a routine for the automation of mathematical calculations. I wrote then to Dr. Horace, who had a column of horoscopes and astrology in Il Tempo Illustrato, published by Palazzi, and I had the information I was looking for. It was my first contact with a future colleague, and here I leave you the historical testimony of the period. In this regard, it must be said that some scholars boast incredible seniority of astrological practice, even before their birth, but naturally they are not able to prove it. This contact with the lawyer Rosanna Zerilli was important for me, not only for the texts she recommended, but above all for the address of the English bookshop where I spent a small fortune for the time, and bought excellent texts by Charles E.O. Carter and other great authors, including several Americans who I didn't like at all, unlike the English. Almost at the same time, but I don't remember how, I had my first contacts with two institutions that would indelibly mark my astrological future, and also the future of astrology itself in Italy, Federico Capone and the Arethusa bookshop, both in Turin. The first was, however, a fellow countryman born in Altavilla, Irpina, with the very old mother who lived 100 meters from my house in Naples, at Arcomirelli. Also in 1971 I had my first contacts with André Barbol, who at that time was very busy writing the texts for Astroflash, the first electronic horoscope that could be ordered on the Champs-Élysées. Horoscope 25 francs, 6 months of forecasts 30 francs horoscope, and 6 months of forecasts 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 comparative charts 30 degrees Fahrenheit, advice for children 25 degrees Fahrenheit, with Francesco Waldner and with Peter Van Wood. Von Houten was his real surname. In the next episode I will talk to you about the Arethusa bookshop and the great Federico Capone, recalling the sensations I felt during these contacts. Before writing about what I anticipated in the previous episode, I feel obliged to make a clarification regarding André Barbol's work with Astroflash. In the next episodes, I will dedicate a very special chapter to my great master, entirely dedicated to him, note 2. Now, however, I would like to clarify the issue of his approach to the electronic horoscope. As I learned later, many events that I will tell you about took place at the same time, but the medium I am using, writing on paper, does not allow me to tell you about events in parallel, but rather events in a serial sequence. André Barbol was rightly fascinated by the possibility of bringing a huge audience closer to astrology through a very well-written electronic horoscope. It should be noted that his Astroflash was not intended to be, and never was, the solar sign horoscope with predictions for the 12 signs. It was a condensation of the archetypes relating to all the positions of a natal sky, calculated, first of all, with excellent precision. However, compared to the original project, André Barbol saw the first part of his monumental work taken away by the publisher, who decided to mark it as a finished work, what was probably only 30 to 40% of the work of the great master. However, I, who was among its first users, found it excellent, even if not exhaustive. Later I was inspired by it in developing my own software for professional astrology,